From Virginia, Mr. Wolf is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, earlier this week, a profound 3-hour debate took place in the House of Commons on the persecution of Christians globally. Multiple British parliamentarians argued with great passion and persuasion that this is the human rights issue of our day and one which demands great attention on the part of the British government and the West more broadly. In some respect, it is a sad commentary that such a conversation was remarkable, and yet it was. When was the last time this body, this Congress, let alone this administration or the State Department, spent even a fraction of that time talking about the thousands of people of faith who daily face discrimination, persecution, violence, and even death simply because of the most deeply held beliefs? It is worth noting that several weeks earlier, the House of Commons had a debate on the persecution of Christians, specifically in the Middle East. There was an overwhelming number of speakers, too many for the allotted time. This week's debate sought to satisfy that interest. In comparison, we have before us relatively modest legislation that has languished in the Senate for 2 consecutive Congresses now, which would create a special envoy within the U.S. Department of State charged with advocating for vulnerable religious minorities in the Middle East and East Central Asia. How do we explain the utter lack of urgency on the part of our own government to address the epic exodus, that of Christianity, from its very birthplace? The House of Commons debate is timely, not simply because of the magnitude and pervasiveness of the problem, but also because millions of professing Christians around the world have just embarked on the Advent season in anticipation of celebrating the birth of Jesus, a birth marked by its humble beginnings in a small Middle Eastern town called Bethlehem. And yet, as British Member of Parliament Sir Tony Baldry noted with a sad irony, quote, "There is now practically no country, from Morocco to Pakistan, in which Christians can freely practice their religion," end of quote. He continued, quote, "There is a severe danger as we start to celebrate the feast of that all Christianity will be almost completely erased from the traditional Middle East holy land of the Bible." Joseph would not now be advised to take Mary to Egypt to avoid the dangers of Herod, because Jesus would not just have been safe there today. To follow on Sir Baldry's line of thinking, the patriarch Abraham would also have a difficult time surviving in Iraq, having come from Ur, which is now Nasiriyah. Jonah would be hard-pressed to make it to Nineveh, which is now in the Mosul area, and Paul could scarcely travel the road to Damascus in Syria. The debate in the House of Commons began with a staggering statistic, namely that one Christian is killed every 11 minutes somewhere on earth for their faith. One Christian is killed every 11 minutes somewhere on earth for their faith. While the focus of the Commons debate was on persecuted Christians, several MPs noted that whether or not you are a person of faith, all should be concerned by this troubling trend. Ultimately, freedom of religion and belief is a bellwether for other cherished freedoms. Where this, quote, first freedom is compromised, the whole human rights is under assault. In country after country, freedom of religion is indeed compromised, and Christians, to borrow a phrase from history, are the eye of the gathering storm. This is perhaps no more true than in the Middle East. Here we see governmental, societal, and communal violence and repression against religious communities which specifically targets religious minorities, including Christians. These realities have been exacerbated by the so-called Arab Spring, a spring which has devolved into winter for many of the most vulnerable in these societies, foremost among them ancient Christian communities. With the fall of Hosni Mubarak, Coptic Christians numbering roughly 8 to 10 million are leaving in droves in the face of increased repression, persecution, and violence. They were increasingly marginalized with the ascendancy of the Muslim Brotherhood. Of course, recent events in Egypt indicate a rejection in part of the Brotherhood's approach. But the situation is fluid, and news reports indicate that Islamists are taking advantage of the unrest to target Coptic Christians. Similarly, Iraq's Christian population has plummeted. Churches have now been targeted, believers kidnapped for ransom, and families threatened with violence if they stay. During the debate in the House of Commons, Canon Andrew White, famously dubbed the, quote, Vicar of Baghdad, as he oversees the only Anglican church in Iraq, was quoted as saying that Christians, quote, are frightened even to walk to church because they might come under attack. All the churches are targets. He went on to say, we used to have 1.5 million Christians. Now we have probably only 200,000 left. There are more Iraqi Christians, he said, in Chicago than there are here. That's amazing. And this body, this Congress, this administration, silent. The issues I've just outlined must be viewed not simply as today's news, but rather through the lens of history. A phrase not often heard outside the majority Muslim world is, quote, first the Saudi people, then the Sunni people. The Saudi people are, of course, the Jewish people. Except for Israel, their once vibrant communities and countries throughout the region are now decimated. In 1948, the Jewish population of Iraq was roughly 150,000. Today, no more than 4 individuals remain. In Egypt, the Jewish population was once as many as 80,000. Now roughly 20 remain. It appears a similar fate may await for the ancient Christian community in these same lands. If the Middle East is emptied of the Christian faith, this will have great geopolitical and, I would argue, spiritual implications. But rather than being met with urgency, vision, or creativity, our government's response has been anemic and at times outright baffling, especially to the communities most impacted by the changing Middle East landscape. Multiple other countries were mentioned during the House of Commons debate, including but not limited to China, Nigeria, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. And keep in mind, the Obama administration has not pushed Iran for the release of Pastor Saeed Abedini. He sits in prison, his life is endangered, and this administration is silent. It was rightly noted with some degree of irony that despite the blood spilt in Afghanistan by British and American forces alike, not a single church remains in that nation. One member of parliament, Rahman Christie, focused on the nation of Pakistan where he was born. He said, quote, I come from a Muslim background, and my father was an imam. When I saw that the topic was persecution of Christians in the 21st century, I knew that it was absolutely right and proper to have a debate on that subject. It is important for the world to realize that persecution goes on. He continued, and I quote, the blasphemy law is at the root of much suffering and persecution of Christians in Pakistan. And then he specifically mentioned the case of Asia Bibi, a Christian mother of 6 who for years has languished in prison and faces the death penalty for her alleged crimes. Do you ever hear her name mentioned on the floor of the House? Do you ever hear her name mentioned at the State Department briefings? Do you ever hear her name mentioned at the White House? Does anyone even know who she cares? Does anyone even care? Faces death penalty for her alleged crimes. Too often, when confronted with these types of cases, the State Department offers unsatisfactory assurances that they, quote, they raised the issue during private bilateral discussions. That is, if they raised it at all. Or perhaps the department issues a, quote, bland statement condemning the violence and then acts as if this is somehow a courageous or principled response to a bloodied assault on innocent human life. This State Department and this president ought to learn from President Reagan and his State Department. President Reagan always advocated for those who were persecuted. And Secretary Baker in the Bush administration always advocated. And this administration is silent. And quite frankly, this Congress, House and Senate, are silent. The suffering church takes little solace in this approach, nor should we. In fact, I profoundly reject this approach. The Congress should profoundly reject this approach. And I humbly submit the church in the West should demand more. For if not them, who? With a few notable exceptions, among them the Catholic Church, specifically Cardinal Dolan, who in his farewell address as head of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops beckoned the bishops to extend their efforts to, quote, dramatic front lines of this battle where Christians are paying for the fidelity with their lives, end of quote. Too few in the American church are burdened with this point of action for their suffering brethren. Reverend Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail is addressed to his fellow, and everyone ought to read Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham jail. It was addressed to his fellow clergymen. Earlier in the letter, he speaks of his love for the church, a love that I share. But then he goes on to admonish his fellow clergymen. This is what Martin Luther King said. That I have been disappointed with the church. When I was suddenly catapulted into the leadership of the bus protest in Montgomery, Alabama, a few years ago, I felt I would be supported by the white church. I felt that the white ministers, priests, rabbis of the South would be among our strongest allies. Instead, some have been outright opponents. All too many others have been more cautious than courageous and have remained silent behind the anesthetizing security of stained glass windows, end of quote. Could we not substitute a few words and be left with a similar critique today? Might the imprisoned Pakistani Christian lament, I thought I would be supported by the church in the West. Might the fearful Coptic Christian cry, I thought the ministers in America would be among our strongest allies. If the church slumbers, Washington will scarcely lead the way. Do not expect the Congress or the administration to lead the way if the church does not lead the way. Advent is a season of expectant waiting, rich in spiritual meaning for believers the world over. My prayer this Advent is that the suffering church would no longer suffer alone, and that we would stand with them and seek a day when, in the words of the beloved Christian carol, all oppression shall cease.